This is IAQ Radio, Indoor Air Quality Radio, the voice of the indoor air quality industry, with your hosts, Radio Joe Hughes and the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. And now, Radio Joe Hughes.
Good day and welcome to IAQ Radio. It's episode 744, I believe, Grayson. I might have the wrong number on here. And we welcome Dr. Joe Spurgeon. He's going to talk about his perspective on the AIHA White Paper, Mold and Dampness in the Built Environment. We've been wanting to talk a little bit about that document for a while now. It's been out for a couple months, I believe, and look forward to talking to Dr. Joe about it. Before we get started, let's thank our sponsors. They're the reason we can continue doing the show. AIQ Radio Association sponsors are AIHA, the American Industrial Hygiene Association at AIHA.org. IICRC, the Institute for Inspection, Cleaning, and Restoration Certification at IICRC.org. The Restoration Industry Association, RIA, at RestorationIndustry.org. The Environmental Information Association, EIA, at EIA-USA.org. Actionable Insights at getinsights.org. IAQ Radio industry sponsors are Particles Plus at particlesplus.com, BioPlanet at byoplanet.com.
And now you can win a cool prize. It's time for the IAQ Radio trivia question. Be the first to correctly answer. Simply email your answer to czlotnick at cs.com. Or if listening live, just text your answer from your computer. And now, here's the Z-Man.
Hello, everyone. Congratulations go out to Robert Skoglund with Convestro, who was first to identify 1963 as the year that the first certified industrial hygienist exam was administered. Here's today's IAQ Radio trivia question. What is the maximum number of times Friday the 13th can occur in any given year? Back to you, Joe.
All right, Joe Spurgeon. He's got a PhD, a multidisciplinary doctorate degree in analytical chemistry and environmental health from the University of Pittsburgh, and we're proud of our graduate, Dr. Joe. Love it. Joe also has a lot of experience in both the public and private sectors. He's been doing mold and other investigations for many, many years. He's also taught courses on mold investigations and sampling, data interpretation, and he's currently doing a lot of expert witness work to understand it. But Joe, let me make sure I got that all right. Howard,
yes.
Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. You and Cliff both. All right.
Hey, Joe, let's start real quick with just some general observations about the white paper and what your overall just general observations are on it.
Well, no, I agree. It's a good white paper. Nothing wrong with it. It's got some general points. I think they're very consistent and been around for many years. So I don't think anyone can disagree with that.
Okay. Well, let's get into your presentation here. I know you've worked a good bit on this, and maybe there's a couple areas where you have some slight differences of opinion, but in general, I think it's a good document. I've enjoyed my opportunity to review it, and let's let you have the stand here.
All right. Very good. Thanks. Okay. Let's kind of get started. First, I'm going to go over what I would call 4 postulates, and this is the basis for my reasoning, so it gives the audience, you and the audience, an idea and an insight into my positions and biases, so you can better evaluate what I have to say. So first, I tend to think that a numerical lab report cannot be interpreted without using numerical guidelines. I think you need a coordinate system, an XY axis, a reference system, where you can place your current data in reference to the previously collected data and get a better perspective on the assessment. And we normally call the process professional judgment. But again, in my opinion, professional judgment is really just a set of implicit guidelines we carry around in our head. They're not stated, but we each have them based on our experience and training.
And Joe, we don't see too much in the way of this type of guidance in the in literature, I guess.
Well, no, because it's personal. And to me, that's one of the problems. If we have implicit, unstated guidelines, we can't talk about them. They're never discussed. But each of us, and I've talked to a lot of students in my class, everybody has them, but it's a taboo subject. We can't talk about them. So to me, if you can state them explicitly, we can argue about them. You may not agree with them, but we can talk about them.
And do you ever see that in your expert witness work? I know you review a lot of reports.
Well, if you consider things like indoor-outdoor comparisons as guidelines, then yes, but that's the level that I see.
Okay, and you're going to show us how to go into a little better level or deeper level here.
Well, I'm going to show you what I tend to use as more explicitly stated guidelines. Not
Okay,
that they're correct, but once they're stated, we can talk about them. We can improve them. You can disagree with them, whatever. But as long as they remain implicit, I don't even know what your guidelines are.
gotcha. Okay.
All right. Second, the objective of an inspection to me is not to detect mold, it's to detect the amplification of mold in the indoor environment, the excessive growth of mold. And to do this, in my opinion, we need methods that can differentiate between normal and amplified conditions. And again, we do this using professional judgment, but that's based on either implicit or explicit guidelines and decision criteria. So,
Hey, Joe, can you go back for 1 second? I want to add a question. Differentiate between normal and amplified conditions. If I go into a home and I see mold, it's obviously there. Is that a method? I mean, my visual inspection, is that one of the methods that you would agree is used to differentiate between normal and amplified conditions?
yes, I would state that it's an essential element of a mold inspection and differentiation, but it in itself is not sufficient.
Okay,
Okay, so there's a difference there between essential and sufficient, in my opinion.
gotcha.
Okay. All right, again, common mold sampling methods and data interpretation methods have significant issues. And I think the white paper pointed that out. And it limits their utility in assessing three things: building-related contamination, occupant exposure potential, and mold-related health risk. But I feel that substantial improvements in assessments can be made if we modify some of our commonly used methods to include what I would call the SOX criteria. And that is, in my opinion, sampling and interpretation methods should satisfy these criteria to the extent possible. For example, it should provide the significance of the sample result. It should contain some sort of reference system, a method for assessing whether the result is low or high. And also, it should measure what we think it is measuring. We should have objective guidelines and decision criteria stated before we start sampling. I don't think this differs from the white paper's position at all. We should have a consistent application between projects and inspectors. So if the condition are similar to Project A, then the assessment should be similar to Project A.
Joe, can you expand on that just a little for me?
Yeah. Again, as an expert witness, I watch a lot of people sample. I've talked to a lot of people in my classes, and there's a lack of consistency between the assessment of the data. You can have the same data from two different projects, and you get entirely different assessments if you talk to different people, especially. And even if you talk to the same person about two different projects, they sometimes come up with different assessments with very similar data.
Gotcha.
Joe, if I may, what about the client? A lot of times, the assessor is looking at this particular assessment based upon the needs and of the client.
Sure.
And it would seem to me that that's going to could have a certain amount of bias because you're trying to support their position or not support or refute this position and so on and so forth. So
well,
go ahead.
Well,
I was
no,
going to
go ahead.
I would say that in these expert witness situations that you find yourself in, most often there's going to be an expert witness on the other side that has an entirely different opinion based upon the same work site, correct?
Correct. And that's why I try to go into any job as an expert witness with facts, not opinions.
Understood. Okay.
And if you have facts, they trump opinions.
Yeah, but
That's
you
what
have
I
your
found.
no, understood, but you have your facts and then they have their facts, based on like where they sampled, where you sampled, so on and so forth. What days you were there, so on and so forth.
Yeah, if you're talking about legal cases, that's more akin to a Broadway production. It's a plan.
Okay.
So there's lots of actors, there's critics, there's producers, there's directors. Sometimes the facts don't matter. Sometimes they do. It's my job to try to make them matter.
Okay. Interesting. Okay.
All right. And again, stable basis for comparing sample results, independent of weather, geography, local conditions, project characteristics, etc. So as an example, if we look at the significance of the sample results, this is just a rank order of 424 indoor Aspen samples. And the significance, this plot gives me a reference system. It gives me a coordinate system in order to evaluate the data so I can tell whether the sample result in the past has been associated with control areas or contaminant areas. It's objective. We got a break point at 1,000 spores per cubic meter. So that's an objective guideline. We can talk about that, agree or disagree, but it's objective. It has consistency. The plot's based on 424 samples. We can add 50 samples. We can subtract 50 samples from the plot. It's not going to change. It's stable. And it has stability. If we compare to indoor-outdoor comparisons, there's no effect from weather, time of day, etc. Okay, so it's a stable basis for comparison. Again, it provides me a coordinate system to assess the data. And the question I have to ask is, the next time I collect one airborne sample in a project, is my sample size 1 or 424 plus 1? And I would state that I now have a sample size of 425. So it gives me better confidence in my results.
Joe, I'm curious, for people that maybe don't have that historical background, that haven't taken 400 and some samples, what would you suggest they use?
Well, I work with people on this. I've worked with several people to use this. This is simple rank order. You start with 20 samples, the last 20 samples you collected. Then you include it, you raise it to 50 samples, then maybe 100 samples. If you go over samples, you don't really gain very much.
Okay.
But you build it. You can build this plot for yourself, and I've taught several people how to do that. Okay.
All right.
Objective guidelines, again, a reference system. This is data for carpet dust samples, 39 samples. And you can look at the distributions for total fungi, group 1 contaminant fungi, group 2 common fungi, and even the individual 36 fungi in an ERMI analysis if you want. And if you look, if you take the ratio of group 1 contaminant to group 2 common fungi, you get a ratio greater than 1 at about the 70th percentile concentration in the distribution, which is about the average concentration. So you can use that as a breakpoint. And you can come up with breakpoints for total fungi, group 1 fungi, individual fungi. We can disagree with this, but this provides me with a reference system where I can place the current sample and compare it to previous samples. And it helps me assess the significance of the data. Okay. It has stability, objectivity, significance.
Now, Joe,
Yeah.
you're an expert and you get a report that you're to evaluate, but you don't have their old data, right? Um, so in that report, should it reference that they are using this reference system and give you some more information to work with?
I'm not quite. You mean when I assess another consultant's report? Is that what you're
Yes.
asking? No, this is what I'm saying. They come in with opinions. I come in with facts. Okay, at least I can explain the facts that I'm coming in with. I have a basis for it. I can show objectively where I got my opinions. I have never encountered anyone else in the legal system that really does that.
Interesting. Okay.
That's why I'm saying I come in with facts, they come in with opinions. And once you start showing data like this and show an arbitrator or a judge or a jury how you got your opinions, you can normally prevail.
Okay.
All right, a stable basis for assessment. Here we have Aspen concentrations, samples collected with an aerosol cassette and a filter cassette. And I'm taking the results from the filter cassette as being the correct ones. They pretty much are. So we have a stable basis of comparison here. But we'll notice as the concentration increases from 1,000 to 75,000 spores per cubic meter, the response of the aerosol decreases from 93% to 42%. So we have an unstable basis. So the question is, can you use an aerosol allergen D, any slit impaction cassette for assessing building-related contamination? Yeah, you can, because at 1,000 to 2,000 spores per cubic meter, it's still fairly efficient. What about occupant exposure? Yes, if you take the time to plot the aerosol data versus the filter cassette data, you can come up with a response curve that allows you to assess occupant exposure. What about mold-related health risk? No, we don't have stability. We don't have speciation with an aerosol. And I can tell you that if there are clumps of spores, very many clumps of spores, let's say 50 spores in a clump, they're not aspirated very efficiently by an aerosol. So they're not reported. So assessing health risk, no. But building-related contamination and exposure potential, I think you can. And I discuss these factors. If you want to look at my website, you can find a broader discussion. So indoor-outdoor comparisons. The white paper talks about 5 key principles for compliance by IAQ mold professionals. And what I'm really going to do in this presentation is discuss those key principles. And one of the first ones is sampling for airborne mold spores can indicate if the mix of indoor molds is typical of the outdoor mix. So it's supporting indoor-outdoor comparisons for airborne samples. This is one area I disagree. If you look at the base program, this is just a number of papers you can find, but McIntosh looked at 44 office buildings in 6 of the 10 EPA regions. His conclusion was that outdoor fungi varied significantly by season, geography, and time of day, with morning concentrations greater than afternoon concentrations. I think that's fairly well accepted. Whereas the indoor fungi did not vary by season, geography, or time of day. So there was little association between indoor and outdoor samples. This is a correlation of 450 indoor and 235 outdoor samples collected in 108 houses. And what we see is the scatter plot for the 108 houses. And a coefficient of correlation ranges from 0, which is basically no correlation, to 1, which is perfect correlation. And the correlation you get here is 0.36. So again, it agrees with McIntosh and other investigators' findings that there's little association between indoor and outdoor aspen, which is a dominant indoor contaminant. And here we look at aerosol aspiration efficiency versus wind speed. This is a hospital remediation, so I was there for 9 days. And the red area gives you the range of indoor mold spore concentrations in that 9-day period. And it was fairly stable because it was a hospital. And we can see on a windy day, we get very suppressed concentrations without much variation. Whereas on calm days, we get much more variation in our results, which is what we would expect from good data, and we get higher peak concentrations. So what's happening is the mold spores on windy days are simply being blown right past the intake of the aerosol. We also look at morning and afternoon spore counts, and I've broken this up into 2 types of aspen, smooth and rough, just very simply. And we can see if we look at rough aspen, there's not very much variation either from morning to afternoon or from day to day. But if we look at smooth aspen, we get substantial variations day to day and from morning to afternoon. So my point is, quite often when using indoor-outdoor comparisons, we're measuring the variability of the outdoor air rather than the condition of the indoor space. So let's look at a comparison of data. The white paper results only represent conditions at the time of the inspection and cannot be compared to other data or averages. This certainly applies to single samples or small sample sets from a project, but in my opinion does not apply to an assessment of a distribution of concentrations. Again, this is a comparison of 204 indoor aerosol samples using the distribution method for assessing building-related contamination. And if we look at the blue plot, the blue data, those are from houses with no water damage. The red data are from houses with water damage. And we can see there's a difference. If there's no water damage, again, we get a 95th percentile concentration of around 750 spores per cubic meter. And we don't have that limitation if there is water damage. If we have a concentration greater than around 1,500 spores per cubic meter, statistically from the data that I have, there's less than a 1% chance that that sample did not come from a contaminated indoor air sample. Okay.
And Joe, how do we differentiate between a water damaged and a non-water damaged property in this slide?
In this case, it was based on 2 parameters. Number 1, the visual inspection, and secondly, a mold dog was used. So we have visual inspection plus the response from a mold dog.
Okay.
All right. So looking at surface samples, let's say you take a surface sample and you get a laboratory report of 5,000 spore equivalents per 100 square centimeters. What does it mean? Well, it depends. If it's a carpet sample, it's a 20th percentile concentration based on my data, so quite typical. However, it was collected from samples of clothing, it's the 90th percentile concentration, so it would be a contaminant of concern. So again, using a methodology like this gives me a reference system, a coordinate system, in order to evaluate my current sample against previously collected samples and their distribution of concentrations. So it helps me come up with an assessment. Okay.
And this is using qPCR.
This is using qPCR, but
Okay.
you can have it for culturable samples or qPCR or whatever.
What about like tape lifts? You couldn't do that with a tape lift, I guess.
No, I don't know how to do it for tape lifts.
Okay.
So this is either swab or microvac cassettes.
Gotcha.
All right, current mold sampling methods. So in my opinion, we have can have 2 primary objectives, that is assessing building-related contamination, which we always tend to do. And I think this is possible do with current methodology. And we're also called upon to assess occupant exposure potential, in my experience, maybe 20-25% of the time. Here, this is limited by current methods, but in my opinion, there are more reliable methods available that improve the assessment. So the white paper seems to emphasize assessing health-related risk, where in my business anyway, my experience, this kind of tends to discount the need to assess building-related contamination and occupant exposure potential, which is what I most often do. So sampling should only be performed if the result provide an answer to a question or hypothesis. Okay, that's pretty standard. Since current methods do not provide information on health risks associated with mold exposures, health assessment is primarily based on the extent of water or moisture damage and mold growth. I agree with that statement also, but I think that statement can be extended. Okay. So here we have the data for 23 surface swabs from air supply ducts. All right. And we can see that aspen spores were detected in 8 of the samples. 15 of the samples were non-detect. So the guideline can either be we don't want any aspen detected on an air supply duct, or we can be a little rational and say, look, there's quite a bit of difference between 250 spores per meter and these 2 ducts, for example. Kind of these 2 stand out from the sample of 23. So we might accept a guideline of 250 spore equivalents per 100 square centimeter. I'm sorry, per square centimeter or whatever. This is per sample. Okay. But the main point is this is non-visible mold. Okay. Even in these 2 supply ducts, it's non-visible. Without routine sampling of supply ducts, you would not detect this differentiation between supply ducts. So my question is exposure to non-visible mold a concern? And when I perform an inspection, it is. Okay.
Let me ask a question on this now. You're doing surface swabs of air supply ducts. Is this inside the ductwork or on the diffuser or the register from the ductwork?
Well, it's either inside or it's on the vertical slots, vertical dividers, one or the other.
Okay.
If I use the vertical dividers, I estimate the area sampled, and I can report the results on area basis or as total per sample. Okay.
And I
But
notice
the point
again you're
is
using spore equivalents, so this is qPCR.
qPCR. In this example, it is, yes. Yes.
Now, what else could you use?
Use culturing.
Okay.
But if you want to be able to, I try to correlate the result from the air supply duct to horizontal surfaces to the air return. In order to do that, if you're going to do that correlation, you need speciation.
Gotcha.
Okay.
So before we move on, can you just go over in the 2 areas that you are collecting from? One is the inside of the ductwork itself.
Well, sometimes not the ductwork, but the boot of the supply register, inside the supply register.
Okay.
Okay. Or I can do the vertical dividers.
What do you mean vertical dividers?
Well, it's slotted. Normally you have vertical slots in an air supply register in a residential property. If I have that, I might use that. If I want to do areas, if I want to do total sample, I might go inside the face of the register and just do the horizontal surfaces and side surfaces.
Okay, so this would be the grill.
The grill.
The grill,
Yeah.
and you're doing this from inside the room, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Then would what you're finding on that grill, what relationship? A lot of times when we okay, let's take the supply rather than the return, just for a
Yes.
moment. You look at that supply, a lot of times they're soiled. And first inclination might be that what we see attached to that register is coming from the inside of the ductwork, as opposed to what we see on that register actually being in the room and being driven onto that surface.
Yes.
Okay.
By recirculation air patterns.
Yeah, by
Yes,
recirculation, air
yes.
patterns, and so
Yeah.
on and so forth. So I guess what my question is could that affect samples that were taken actually on the grill itself? Would that recirculation have any effect
I
or
haven't
not?
seen that. And again, I'm looking for correlations between what's coming out of the air supply register, what's on the horizontal surfaces, and what's on the air return. So I would take 3 samples, not just one. I will also tell you I have similar data that is looking at the correlation between what's on the coil and what's on the air supply grill. And there's very little correlation of the moles on the coils and what's coming and detected on the grills. So if you want to assess occupant exposure potential, in my opinion, you're better off sampling the air supply grill.
Okay.
Okay. You know what? This is a good spot for us to stop and thank our sponsors at halftime here. It looks like we're just about right at halftime anyway with your presentation, Joe. So let's stop and thank our sponsors. We'll be right back with Dr. Joe Spurgeon. Our association sponsors are AIHA, Healthy Workplaces, A Healthier World, AIHA.org. The Environmental Information Association, EIA's multidisciplinary membership collects, generates, and disseminates information concerning environmental and occupational health hazards in the built environment at EIA-USA.org. The IICRC, a nonprofit standards development and certifying body for the cleaning and restoration industry, IICRC.org. The Restoration Industry Association, the oldest and largest nonprofit professional trade association dedicated to providing leadership and promoting best practices through advocacy, standards, and professional qualifications for the restoration industry at restorationindustry.org. Actionable insights, no more mistakes, no more missed line items in your Xactimate estimates at getinsights.org. Industry sponsors are Particles Plus, feature-rich particle counters and air quality instrumentation. Count on us, particlesplus.com. BioPlanet at byoplanet.com, improving human, animal, and environmental health with electrostatic spray technology and advanced chemistries at byoplanet.com. All right, and this is our last show of the year, so I wanted to make sure to send out a thank you to all of our sponsors. We really appreciate your support, and without it, we probably couldn't continue doing the show. So let's finish the second half of Dr. Joe's presentation here. Joe, let me turn it right back over to you.
Okay, probably running a little bit behind, but let's see what we can cover. So current methods for mold. White paper states microbial measurements are not currently used for estimating dampness or mold-related health risks. Certainly agree with that. Okay, a little bit out of, right, I skipped some, sorry. Current method, sampling should only be performed if the results provide an answer to a question or hypothesis. Okay, problem. Since current methods do not provide information on health risks associated with mold exposures, health assessment is primarily based on the extent of water or moisture damage and mold growth. And maybe I went backwards, I'm sorry. So that was the first example. One example is the laboratory method for analyzing surface dust. I'd like to talk about this. Each laboratory has a standard operating procedure, and it's important to understand that when we send in a sample of dust, no matter how many milligrams of dust are in that sample, they're probably going to analyze a 5 milligram portion of the dust. And they're going to report milligrams of mold per milligram of dust, for example, for spore equivalents, whatever. But the number of milligrams in the sample is not reported. So we really don't know what the total number of spore counts or fungal loading is for the entire sample. And this is just an example to illustrate that. So the laboratory SOP is to report surface dust samples on a weight analyzed basis. So if we collect a sample, two samples, surface 1, surface 2, different conditions, 6 by 6, 12 by 12, let's say we collect 40 milligrams in sample 1, 100 milligrams in sample 2. None of this information is going to be reported. The total weight of the sample is not reported by the laboratory unless you ask them to. Let's also assume they both report 1,000 CFUs per 5 milligram sample. What the inspector is going to do is receive a report that says the fungal loading in both samples is the same. If you report on a weight analyzed, which is the standard methodology. If you ask them to give you the total weight, you can calculate on an area basis. On an area basis, have 222 CFUs per square inch, 139 CFUs per square inch. Just trying to illustrate that the area basis reflects the relative conditions of surfaces maybe more appropriately. And also you have to ask the question on all these methods, does the sample result measure what you think it measures? Okay. So if we look at least these two papers, health effects were better associated with the results when reported on an area basis. And we can almost intuitively understand that the fungal loading per unit area surface is better correlated with occupant exposure. We can imagine an occupant vacuuming a carpet. If you vacuum wall-to-wall carpeting versus 2x4 throw rug, you have different exposure potentials, and that varies by the area of exposure.
Okay.
All right. So assessing surface dust molds, if you want to improve the assessments, in my opinion, it's very simple. Measure the area sampled, ask the lab to report the total sample weight, and assess your sample results on an area basis. Is this a perfect methodology? No. Is it better than what the standard operating procedure is? I believe it might be.
Are any labs at all doing what you recommend here, Joe?
Any lab will do it if you ask them to do it.
You have to ask. Okay.
You have to ask them to do it, yeah. So visual inspection. AIHA White Paper said current methods do not provide information on health risks. Health assessments primarily based on the extent of water or moisture damage, visible mold, etc. Microbial measurements are not currently useful for estimating dampness or mold-related health risks. I certainly agree with that. But let's look at visual inspection versus sampling. So here we have an example of 159 aerosol samples collected in 44 houses with no visible mold or water damage detected. And again, the inspection was done with visual inspection plus mold dog present. So 22% had aspen in a range of 1,000 to 5,000 spores per cubic meter, which I consider to be a little elevated. 10% had aspen in the range of 5,000 to 55,000 spores per cubic meter. The point here is that 32% of potentially problem houses would have been missed if the sampling had been conducted. And more significantly to me, the inspector would not have been aware of these problem houses because sampling had not been performed, and they would not be aware that the problem houses had been missed. And they would never be able to correct their methodology to account for that because they would not be aware of it. This is one of the reasons, in my opinion, a comprehensive quality inspection must include reliable.
Now, Joe, let's go back for just a second. These 44 houses with no visible, why were they being inspected in the first place? Do you know?
Yeah, from my personal experience, over my career, I would say 20% of the houses, 25% of the houses I inspect don't have any mold problem at all that I can detect. Maybe around 40 to 50% have a mold problem that's obvious based on a visual inspection and moisture meter profile. But about a third of the houses I inspect, I would not determine that there was a problem unless I had sampled. So I'm in agreement with the previously presented data, which I did not collect, by the way. Another consultant collected it. I'm just analyzing it and reporting it. So
But I'm just curious, what do you think was the reason the homeowner asked for a mold assessment?
Most of them have gone on the internet and have become mold experts.
Okay. Okay. That's all I needed to know.
Okay.
So they're worried about mold even though they don't see
Yeah.
anything, they don't
Yeah, a
smell
lot of
anything.
people have a concern about mold. They have anxiety about it.
Sure.
Or and they just want their home checked as a baseline.
Okay.
So assessing health risks using current methods. White paper, there are no recognized or accepted quantitative health-based microbial exposure guidelines or thresholds based on existing methods for air or dust samples. I certainly agree. One issue I have is that if we continue to use current methods as they currently exist and are applied, we will never be able to associate mold concentrations with health effects. So it's kind of the definition of insanity. You keep repeating something that doesn't work over and over, expecting a better outcome, and it's not going to happen. So this is an example of assessing occupant exposures. This is a commercial facility, 75 employees. 5 of them, or 7%, were hospitalized within 3 weeks of the incident water incursion. So my question is, were the data consistent with the observed conditions? And I think this is a question we should always ask ourselves. So here we have 5 samples collected, 2-minute samples using an N6 sampler. And if you look at the whole correction tables, the maximum reportable concentration is given as somewhere around, I've forgotten exactly, but 7,700 CFUs per cubic meter. So if you look at the maximum reported concentration of 4,800, everything looks good. There shouldn't be a problem. But to me, the data didn't look correct. So I did something that maybe a lot of us don't want to do, but I created a log plot. And here we have the blue, in blue, the 5 data points. And we would expect a straight line log plot, but we don't. We get what's called a right truncated plot. And that tells us that the sampler had saturated. And it also tells us that the maximum reportable concentration that the analyst could detect was about 5,000 CFUs per cubic meter. Okay. So at this point in time, I know that I can never determine the true average occupant exposure, but I know the reported average was not correct. Okay. So the best I can do is adjust these top 2 samples and make them fit onto the extrapolated line. That's the best option I have. If we do that, based on the laboratory report, the average occupant exposure was 2,540 CFUs per cubic meter. The estimated corrected average exposure is 48,000 CFUs per cubic meter, a factor of 19 higher. If we continue to use N6 samplers, which is a qualitative sampler, and try to make it fit into our quantitative framework, I don't think we're ever going to be able to get an association between health risk and mold concentrations. Okay.
Now, hasn't the use of N6 samplers kind of gone out of favor? Do you still see that in reports?
Well, it depends. This is an example. Again, this is some older data that I collected many years ago.
Okay.
Okay, so this is what I have. Would I use qPCR today? I probably would, but back then I didn't have it. Okay. But a lot of the data, a lot of the conclusions are based on culturable data. Okay.
Okay.
So the point is, some samplers, whichever sampler you may prefer, adverse health effects occur at elevated concentrations, and especially the N6 sampler, on a lot of our archive data is based, has critical limitations, and it really cannot be used to assess adverse health effects at higher concentrations. So the question is there a better method for assessing occupant exposure potential? Not health risk, but occupant exposure potential. And I believe that a filter cassette will work. All right. Here we have about 6 projects. So samples 1 through 5 is one project, 5 through 10 is the second project, etc. So if we just look overall, we have a very good correlation between filter cassettes and the N6 sampler, correlation of 0.96. But we can see with the N6, we get a maximum of 5,000, a maximum of 5,000. Whereas if we use a filter cassette, we can determine that this maximum was probably correct, whereas this maximum totally underestimated the occupant exposure. The filter cassette gives us 30,000 CFUs per cubic meter. The N6, again, is limited to 5,000. So in my opinion, filter cassettes used for assessing occupant exposures can both detect elevated occupant exposures and correlate with the N6 for lower concentrations. So maybe this is why the OSHA Method 14 for mold spores specifies the use of filter cassettes with a 0.8 micron MCE filter. Okay. Maybe they know something we don't.
Well, that's similar to what they did with asbestos sampling, isn't it?
Well, it's using the same, I use the same cassette, a PCM cassette. That's my preferred cassette for air sampling. And that's what I've used throughout my career, basically, except I use the bi-air filter cassette rather than just a standard cassette.
Okay.
So sample size. So sampling data must be comprehensive and communicated in a form useful to physicians, other professionals, occupants, decision makers. Samples should not be collected without a clear purpose that has been determined ahead of time. Sampling. I agree with all that. A sufficient number of samples must be collected to reliably assess the existing conditions. I agree with that. But what this doesn't talk about is when can we collect these samples and what do we do with them once we've collected them? So again, here we're looking at 329 air samples, ASPEN concentration stratified by condition of no water damage, and visible mold. And the 70th percentile concentration is pretty close to the average concentration. And we can determine from data like these that in either water damaged properties or properties with visible mold, you get pretty similar average concentrations, average exposures. All right. And you can also look at the average exposures in water damage and visible mold properties versus non-damaged properties through about 6 to 7-fold higher exposures. Worst case exposures, that's what can happen on the days you don't sample, are about 16 to 22 times higher. Okay. So again, this is a reference system. These data provide me a reference system for assessing the next sample that I collect. Okay.
So is this a filter cassette or a spore trap?
This is an aerosol cassette. These are aerosol cassette data. Again, I didn't collect these data. Another consultant did.
Okay.
And I'm analyzing the data for them. Okay.
Gotcha.
But I think this is very useful. If and when I do use aerosols, this gives me a basis for assessing my data. So the purpose of these data is to characterize residential exposures, which we can do. And again, when I assess exposures, what's the sample size? Is my sample size on the next property I inspect a sample size of 1 or 3 or 5? Or is it the 329 samples in this data table? Okay. So this is with 59 carpet stratified condition, and the conditions are either control areas adjacent to glass doors and windows, which were potentially colonized, or where there was visible water intrusion or visible mold, which I characterized as colonized. And these were assigned prior to sampling, and the purpose was to see if whether we could come up with guidelines and decision criteria for assessing building-related contamination. And the control areas, we got a geometric mean concentration, a median concentration of a little over 100. Potentially contaminated was around 1,300, and water damaged areas around 9,000. So if we look at just very broadly, we had 100, 1,000, and 10,000 CFUs per 100 square centimeters. So we had pretty good separation between these three groups of carpets. So I used these data to come up, this is the plot of the data, and the differences are statistically significant with the 95th percentile confidence limits. So using this methodology, we can detect clean carpet. It's not as easy to differentiate between condition 2 and condition 3 carpet, but we can assign decision criteria. It's arbitrary, but I can assign decision criteria of no response necessary, restore and return to service, or discard. So we can come up with statistically significant numerical guidelines, and we can assign decision criteria based on our professional judgment. And again, the next carpet I sample, do I have a sample size of 1 or 59 plus 1? And I would tell you I have the larger sample size because, again, here I have a reference system, a coordinate system that allows me to assess the data.
Go ahead, Joe. I wanted you to get to this topic before we get too far along.
Well, okay. All right. The position on mycotoxins is none of the agriculturally important mycotoxins are produced by fungi that grow on water-damaged building materials. I found that to be a very interesting statement. Don't disagree with it. And these are the 5 mycotoxins they're referring to. There are validated tests for mycotoxins in animals, but not for human serum or urine samples. And there are no reference ranges for mycotoxins in humans. I think that's all pretty, well, some inspectors would agree with that, some would not. I will leave it up to you. There's something called the TLVs and BEIs that are published by ACGIH on a yearly basis. They're updated on a yearly basis. And if you look inside that book, a page looks something like this. So it gives us the matrix, urine or blood. It tells us the sampling time. They specify that the sample should be taken end of shift or end of shift at end of work week, or it doesn't really matter, whatever. And this is the important column I want to talk about. These are biological exposure indices. And you'll see that all of them, okay, are standardized to creatinine. All right, so this gives us a standard response. It's like the difference between reporting spores per cubic meter or the raw count of spores. So this is standardized, and it's important to recognize that they use the standardized basis. Also, there are no BEIs for mycotoxins. So creatinine is used to standardize the toxin concentrations so that the data are reported as weight of toxin per gram or liter of creatinine. So the results can be compared to those for other people. And it's important because to compare the results for a 75-year-old grandmother and a 22-year-old bodybuilder, you have to standardize the results or you can't make that comparison. Okay. So Great Plains Lab, as an example, does an 11 mycotoxin scan. They report the results as nanograms per gram of creatinine, and they specify a sampling time, first morning urine, 10 milliliters at least in volume. And their report looks something like this. The results are reported. It gives you a typical range. And it gives you a comparison graph. So, for example, ochratoxin was reported at 62 nanograms per gram. The range is 4 to 20, and it exceeded the typical range. Okay, so in this report, the results are standardized to creatinine, but the mycotoxins include aflatoxin and ochratoxin, which are agriculturally important mycotoxins. If you look at a report from real-time laboratory, you get the reported value in parts per billion. You get the result, either present, not present, whatever was found. And they give you guidelines for if it was less than 1.8 part per billion, then they say not present. If it was more than 2 parts per billion, then they say it was present. So in this case, the results are not standardized. And again, aflatoxin and ochratoxin, agriculturally important fungi, are included in the report. And that's all I'm going to say about mycotoxins.
So you don't necessarily disagree.
Disagree with what?
With the statements in the AIHA document.
I'm not going to make any statements. I can't disagree.
Okay.
I think a lot of people have those opinions. I think what you do get into is a lot of mold consultants disagree. That's their opinion. So you have a lot of varied opinions on mycotoxins. But I tried to show that at the very least, you need at least standardized data, and even then, you have to draw your own conclusions as to what the significance of data are.
Okay.
So the mold report. White paper, at a minimum, reports should include a statement of purpose and limitations, observations, results, conclusions, and recommendations. And speculations or medical causation should not be included in the report. Agree with all that? Not a problem. The mold report must provide information that can be translated into an action plan for remediation, provides a basis for protecting the health of occupants and remediation workers, and be useful for the intended audience. Documentation. Investigators should provide clear and consistent field notes with sufficient detail and documentation that allow the field work and sampling data to be interpreted, verified, and repeated. For example, this photograph should not be the total documentation of moisture contents in your report. And the sad fact is that in 99% of the reports that I review, that is the only documentation of moisture contents in the report. Okay, so this is common practice that we're looking at in this photograph.
Just one photo of one moisture meter spot on the wall.
No, they give me multiple photographs, but I don't know if you can read that or not, but I can't.
Okay, I got you.
And there's no written documentation. Okay.
Okay. Now I understand.
Nothing. So as far as documenting using field sheets, this is an example of a field sheet that I would use for surface dust. It gives the location of the sample, the surface that was sampled, sampling parameters, and gives conditions or notations as to why I collected the sample. It will also tell you that on the carpet, I sampled the perimeter wall underneath the center window in the living room in an area that extended in a rectangle that was 3 inches to 2 feet from the perimeter wall underneath that window. The couch, I sampled the top surface of the cushions. So at least you know where I sampled, what I sampled, how much I sampled, okay, and basically why. So I also use data tables for interpreting my samples. This is an example data table for air samples. It gives the room, for example, or the floor. Get as much information as you want in the table. It's rank ordered as to the dominant contaminant spore detected in the air, which is typically aspen, the percentages, relevance to, in relationship to the outdoor concentration, which areas were less than, more than. And I also try to assess, using data like this, ICRC conditional area for use by the remediation contractor whenever possible. So by using data tables, we have the data in rank order by dominant contaminant spores. We include information on percentage or ratios as appropriate, and to the extent possible, ICRC conditional areas are assigned. Okay. So in my opinion, a quality assessment report is a report that converts reliable data into usable, actionable information by using and applying reliable principles and methods, documenting the inspection using field sheets, assessing and interpreting the results using data tables, associating conclusions with specific results and supporting recommendations with specific conclusions, and communicating that information clearly and effectively using the least technical language possible. So just to briefly, this is a summary of the AIHA positions that I gleaned from the white paper. Investigation must be based on an informed visual and olfactory assessment that may be augmented by the judicious use of existing sampling methods. Observable indicators of dampness and mold are the best surrogates for determining if a problem exists. Estimates of the extent of visible mold or dampness are the best predictors of short and long-term health outcomes. Since current methods do not provide information on health risks associated with mold exposures, health assessment is primarily based on the extent of water or moisture damage, and I would include visible mold growth. Microbial measurements are not currently useful for estimating dampness or mold-related health risks. But I have some opinions on that, and this kind of summarizes my opinion. I agree with every opinion and every position that AIHA came up with, essentially. But instead of my focus on mold-related health risk, I focus on assessing building-related contamination and occupant exposure potential, which I think are more feasible. So if we want to look at the contaminant assessment, it consists typically of 3 parts if you're an industrial hygienist. An exposure assessment: is the contaminant present? And I try to give an example that in 32% of the problem houses, the problem was missed without sampling, for example. A risk assessment is the second part. Is the concentration sufficiently elevated to be of concern? And here I differentiate between contaminants and contaminants of concern. Aspergillus penicillium molds are certainly a contaminant in the indoor environment, but are they a contaminant of concern? And this is an actual term. When I was with CDC, I think my job title was health assessment scientist. And I spent a lot of time identifying contaminants of concern on various projects. In my opinion, it's kind of necessary to sample if you're going to determine if a contaminant is a contaminant of concern. Qualitative parameters alone result in false negatives. One example is the air supply ducts. If you don't sample air supply ducts, you're not going to know if they're contaminated and contributing to occupant exposures. And risk management, we haven't really talked about. The white paper seemed to place a reliance on qualitative methods, dampness, odors, visible mold, etc., and the limitations of current sampling methods for assessing mold-related health risk. I got the sense that it minimized a consideration of the practical necessity for assessing building-related contamination and occupant exposure potentials. And I personally question in every investigation that I do, qualitative methods alone are any more reliable for assessing condition than current sampling methods. I personally prefer to combine them to give a more comprehensive assessment of the indoor condition.
But go back, if you would, for 1 second, Joe.
Yeah.
You question whether the qualitative methods are any more for assessing condition than current sampling methods. Is that your current sampling methods or current sampling methods common in the industry?
Well, no, it's current sampling methods as currently applied. But just because I use different methods doesn't mean they're perfect. But I think we have a habit of, the old saying goes, making perfect the enemy of the good. If a method is better at assessing condition than currently used methods, why not use it? Okay. Just because
Okay.
it's not perfect, if it's an improvement, at least consider.
Fair enough.
Okay. And again, as I've stated in the other example, if we continue to use current methods as currently applied, we will never be able to associate mold concentrations with health effects. Okay. Even if a method isn't perfect, if it improves the ability to address BRC and OEP, again, why not use it? And the answer is professional organizations are not familiar with these methods and do not support them. And number two, I've talked to a number of mold inspectors in my classes, and every one of them mentioned fear of legal liability. No one else uses those methods. I'm not going to use them. So they're not taught, they're not supported, and there's a fear of legal liability. And unless we can overcome this issue, our industry is never going to improve. And that's my opinion. So with that, I'll end my presentation. I want to thank you for allowing me to do it, and those of you who are listening for listening to what I have to say.
Fair
Again,
enough, Joe. Cliff, I want to make sure I get you a chance to jump in. We're a little over, but you
Joe,
still did a great job.
If you would just send me the slides, I would greatly appreciate it. And
I will.
can we have permission to include them in the blog? Is that all right?
Yes, sure.
Or a link to it.
No, that's quite fine.
No problem. All right.
Joe, we always appreciate having you join us. Before we go, is there anything you'd like to add? Anything we missed?
No, I think the white paper is a good paper, but it's fairly standard in its outlook and recommendations. I think it's just very, very recommendations.
Okay. And you're going out on a little more of a limb? But you
Not
feel
a
like you
limb.
have a good sturdy trunk holding you up?
No, I try to, what I'm trying to say here is I just don't have opinions. I try to gather data and follow the data. And if I try a new method and it doesn't work, I use something else. But I try to keep looking until I find something I feel comfortable with. I don't just use what people tell me to use.
Joe, it's always a pleasure. I always enjoy getting a chance to talk to you, and look forward to 2025 and talking to you then. And always, like I said, always great to talk to you, Joe.
Thank you. Thank you again.
All right, this is Radio Joe Hughes saying thanks to this week's guest, Dr. Joe Spurgeon, my co-host, the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick, our engineer, Grayson, Gone Fishing Fisher, of course, our sponsors, and most importantly, our loyal audience. We appreciate every one of you. Hope you have a tremendous remainder of 2024. Look forward to seeing you again in 2025. We'll be back on January 10th. We've got Dr. Elliot Horner and I can't remember the other name, but we're going to talk a little bit with Dr. Horner and one of his colleagues from Harvard on some papers they put together, and looking forward to a great 2025. So we'll see you back then, and good day, and thanks for listening to IAQ Radio Plus.
For IAQ Radio, I'm Spike Reel saying thanks for listening.